Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by Dr Rebecca Yeo, who is the author of Disabling Migration Controls, Shared Learning, Solidarity and Collective Resistance. Thanks for joining us, Rebecca.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
I guess just to begin with, we should say that the book is available through Routledge. It is open access, so it is free for anyone to get if they go to routledge.com. Could you tell us a little bit about your history with disability activism and I guess asylum seeker activism and how they've come together?
I've been involved in the disabled people's movement for a long time, like about, 30 years. Too long to imagine, really. And then I started getting involved with the asylum sector around beginning of this century. So, after the 1999 Asylum and Immigration Act. And it was at that point, because I would become so aware of disability issues, I was really shocked by how little awareness there was in the asylum sector, even in the voluntary sector. So people who were really trying to build a fairer system. And there, it was things that were kind of just common sense in the disabled people's movement, like you don't have a meeting up several flights of stairs. And when I questioned people about this in the voluntary asylum sector, people were saying things like, oh, well, no wheelchair users are coming anyway. And, it was like, well, they're not going to come, are they?
No, why might that be?
Yeah. So that kind of got me to looking at, so where are disabled people? Actually, around that time as well, I was just starting to do some work, some research with UK Disabled People's Council a few years after that. And I rang up a major national refugee charity and asked them what information they'd got for disabled people seeking asylum. And the receptionist said to me, well, disabled people don't come and seek asylum. Disabled asylum seekers don't exist, the person said. And that's kind of what led me to realise quite how bad the problem is, quite how little awareness there is, or was.
What was the disabled people's movement like when you began engagement with it, and what does it look like now?
Okay, so in the disabled people's movement, so if we start, so in the 80s and starting a bit earlier, really, but that's when the social model of disability was developed, and that was like the key organising principle of the disabled people's movement in Britain, anyway. And that, initially, that was developed by people like Michael Oliver, who was a disabled sociologist, and at its original state, it's a really radical organising principle. It's not only about, it is about access, but it's not only about access, it's also anti-capitalist. It's calling for systemic change. It's a really fundamental principle of it is that disabled people are not the problem. The problem is the ways that society is organised. And that if society is organised to value people according to what they produce in a capitalist economy, then many disabled people are always going to be disadvantaged. And that whole principle of what we need is to change society rather than to change individual disabled people became the principle of the disabled people's movement that was like transformative for many people. I mean, Liz Crow has spoke about it, how it has saved lives. It changed the way people thought of themselves and about society. I think it's really, really important to recognise that those original principles of the social model have been co-opted and distorted on a big scale. So nowadays, like big charities, government, political parties will quite routinely sometimes will refer to the social model, but what they mean by it is something entirely different. They've kind of taken out all the radical principles of it, and instead it just means that you need access.
So you just need a ramp. Just need a ramp.
Well, exactly, yeah. And also, I mean, there was a conference a few years ago, and I saw that it was about building more accessible workplaces, and that they said on that they use social model principles. And what it was talking about was social model principles in order to ensure that more disabled people can join the workforce, which is like, it's just co-opting the basic principles of it in order to become a tool of government.
Yes, I think it's missing an important element there.
It really is. It's missing the whole radical principle of it. But the thing is, I've come to the conclusion that if an organising principle isn't co-opted, it probably means it wasn't actually very effective. So it's not really, when something's co-opted, it isn't a reason to abandon it. It's a reason to recognise that this is actually really powerful and that it is being co-opted and distorted because it's such an important principle, which is why I think that the original social model of disability is actually remains really fundamentally important to organising.
Rebecca, you made reference to a law that was introduced, I think you said in 1999, that transformed the legal conditions for asylum seekers. Can you explain what happened and what's the state of the current laws that are governing asylum in the UK?
Yeah, so in terms of that intersectional entitlements in terms of disability and immigration, I think the 1999 Immigration and Asylum Act was really important because it removed people's rights to access the welfare state. So, for example, disabled people lost the right to access what was then disability living allowance. And the whole emphasis, so this, we should note that this was under New Labour. It was under Tony Blair's government, the early years of his government. And that legislation was really focused on making a distinction between people who are deserving and people who aren't deserving. So it was lots of reference to genuine and the whole basis. I mean, to be fair, asylum and immigration legislation has always been about distinguishing between people who are deserving and people who are not deserving. But this was using that distinction to justify removing people's entitlement to access the welfare state. And I think one of the things that is so important about that legislation when we look at that time is that Tony Blair then made a speech the same year that came in. It was a Beveridge lecture, so it was about the welfare state. He didn't reference legislation about the asylum system at all, and yet he basically set out the principles by which he wanted to reform the welfare state. And he was talking about the need to shift to modernise the welfare state. So he sort of claimed that he was still in favour of a welfare state, but he was building on the original principles of it, and he was just modernising it and shifting to a system of individual responsibility, which then became, though the basic principles that he set out in 1999 can be seen then that were used later in the welfare reforms that were introduced by subsequent governments. And that whole principle of, like, you have to show that you've got individual responsibility before you become deserving. That then also means that you're blamed, that, individual responsibility then also leads to individual blame, which becomes the basis for removing support. So it was exactly the same principles that were being imposed on asylum seekers in 1999 it wasn't possible at that point to remove all access to the welfare state for disabled people who were citizens. But by gradually shifting the discourse and introducing those ideas that some people are not entitled to have their basic human needs met, that's what Tony Blair was putting forward, and that became the basis for welfare reforms. And that, since then, that has become worse and worse in both sectors. So if we look at how disability policy has developed and how immigration policy has developed, we can see that they both sort of develop in parallel, and restrictions are imposed on one sector. It's like it's experimenting happen. So it's like remove those restrictions from disabled people, and then that shows that it's possible, and then we can remove them from people seeking asylum, and vice versa. And that's continuing today. So the current situation where, the current Labour Party is still very focused on that threat, supposedly, of people arriving in small boats, and at the same time focusing on the government is introducing the new budget tomorrow, and what they've leaked about it so far, there's so much emphasis on support for working people, which clearly frames people who are not in paid work as if a problem, as if a burden. And that includes disabled people who don't have access to paid work, and also people seeking asylum who are not allowed to work and in many cases are not able to find paid work. So it's framing both marginalised groups, people who are already struggling. It's framing both of those people as if a threat, as if a burden on the wider population.
I've got to say that sounds eerily familiar.
Yeah.
And in terms of entitlement, I think Tony's entitled to appear in The Hague. But anyway, that's Cam.
Rebecca, as you've noted, obviously there are disabled asylum seekers. You've also noted that the hostile environment and asylum policy in general is disabling. Could you tell us a little bit about the ways in which that's the case?
Yeah, so, that's a lot of my work now is focused on that, like acknowledging that the hostile environment, the restrictions that are imposed on people seeking asylum deliberately prevent people. They're deliberately designed to prevent people from accessing essential services and support. Now, that is what the social model of disability was designed to counter. But when the social model of disability was developed in the 1980s towards disabled people, a lot of those restrictions, not all, but a lot of those restrictions were the result of oversight. So, which is bad enough, and it's unjust that it was not even considered that disabled people might exist or might need access to mainstream education, for example, or whatever. But in terms of the asylum system, those restrictions are entirely deliberate. So the hostile environment was explicitly, that label was explicitly used by Theresa May with the aim to make the system sufficiently hostile as to cause people to leave the country or not to come. So it's deliberately designed to deprive people of essential needs, which causes people's lives to be lost, and it also stokes hatred among the wider population. So I do think when I'm talking about these parallels between the two sectors, and I'm saying how relevant the social model of disability is for resisting these restrictions in the asylum system. But I do also think it's really important to recognise that the situation that we face now has developed far beyond when the social model of disability was originally designed. So the policies that are now deliberately designed to deprive people of essential needs, with the effect that people's lives are being lost, that has gone beyond the needs of capitalism. But that is a core element of the rise of fascism.
Rebecca, you've made reference to the implementation of these policies over a considerable period of time, including by the Labor Party. And they seem to have, well, I guess the question is, do you think they were designed with this intent? And in whose interest do you think these destructive policies are being pursued?
Yes, I think they are designed with that intent. I mean, the very fact that, Theresa May set it out for us, that was the intent of the hostile environment. But, it wasn't like she was first. It was just that she set it out very clearly and explicitly that these policies are designed to deprive people of essential needs. And in terms of the wider population of disabled people, the restrictions that are now being imposed and were imposed by previous governments were supposedly designed in order to reduce this apparent burden. So in both sectors, human beings are being framed as if a burden rather than as having needs that need to be met. And in terms of what does that achieve? Well, it is a way of scapegoating. It distracts people from what is really going on by making people think that the problem that we face is caused by people in small boats or disabled people who are being deprived of essential services. The very most marginalised people who are struggling for survival, are the people who are being blamed for a system that is benefiting billionaires and depriving everybody else of essential services. So I think these, part of the reason that I think it's so important to bring together the resistance in terms of the disabled people's movement and people resisting the restrictions imposed on people seeking asylum is that we need to build a more united form of resistance. And we can do that by learning from each other rather than what is currently happening and what has been happening for a long time is that these two lots, the governments learn from each other. They, as I said, that policies are imposed on people in the asylum system and imposed on the wider population of disabled people, like in parallel. And the government learns from their experiments with one sector and then extends those restrictions to the other sector. But in terms of resistance, that doesn't happen nearly enough. It's like people are generally either involved in resistance in terms of asylum and immigration or in terms of the disabled people's movement. What I'm saying is that we really desperately need to bring these together and that this isn't something about like being good people or something. Very often if we talk about disability, the solution is framed as if it is inclusion. But when we bring the sectors together, it then becomes really clear how flawed that goal is. So, for example, the Bibby barge in Britain is a barge that's housing people seeking asylum moored off the south coast of Britain. And it's not accessible to many disabled people, which has spared some people from being housed there. So if detention centres and accommodation centres like that were to become more accessible and inclusive of disabled people, it wouldn't build justice. And I think that's a really, if we bring the sectors together, it becomes really clear that inclusion in an oppressive agenda does not address injustice. And instead, that we need to work together to build systemic change and to build a system where everybody's needs are met. So irrespective of what somebody's impairment is or what their migration background is.
Rebecca, you did make reference to political scapegoating and the ways in which exclusionary politics, social marginalisation and this distinction between the deserving and undeserving lay the groundwork for a kind of fascist politics.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things I've noticed in the UK recently, earlier this year, was there was a series of riots which were directed towards asylum seekers and migrants on the basis of a particular narrative that had developed out of a tragic event. I guess the question I had was, what do you think what are the public attitudes towards asylum seekers and people with disabilities, and what do you think those events meant in this context?
Yeah, so if we're talking about public attitudes, I mean, we can't see that like in a void. So if the media and government from the highest level is promoting hostility and blame towards disabled people and towards people seeking asylum and the wider migrant population, then for most people, that's where they get their information from, and that kind of encourages people to be blaming and targeting those marginalised communities as if that's the cause of their problems. And obviously, obviously it's much easier for people to direct blame at individuals rather than to acknowledge that the problem is systemic and that we need systemic change, which can feel more nebulous. But yes, certainly there is hostility towards disabled people seeking asylum and towards disabled people seeking asylum. But the thing is that that's often done as if it's in a void. It's like when people don't actually know people and don't actually understand what it's like, and the similarities that we've all got in the ways that our needs are not being met, the ways that the injustices and restrictions that are being extended to an ever wider population. So I do think that the level of hostility is sometimes exaggerated if we only look at the media and if we look at the discourse that comes from the government or mainstream politicians. In terms of personal interactions, obviously there are overt fascists that are promoting hatred and hostility towards individuals, but generally, the general human response, if it wasn't for this sort of media reaction, if you see somebody struggling, the natural human response is to help that person. And it's only through the media and the government and that hatred that is being deliberately targeted at people who are struggling, who are marginalised. And that makes people override that natural human response to help each other. So I would argue that these sort of principles of building a system in which everybody's needs are met, it isn't actually such a radical demand. It's actually just a basic human response. We all want our needs to be met. We all want to be living in a society where everybody looks out for each other. There's nothing radical about that. It's just that at present we're living in a society where that does not happen because of the policies that are coming from the government and are promoted through the media.
Rebecca, one of the projects you've been involved with is called Disability Murals. Could you tell us a little bit about that project and how you incorporate art into your research and activism?
I use art and public murals a lot as a research method. And part of that is about bringing people together with a task, which is actually, so in terms of the research, it's actually making like the product of the research is a painted mural in a public space, which is designed to convey like the key messages of the people who are taking part in it. And it's also a way of people claiming a public space. And it's also that the process of coming together and deciding what messages people want to have in that, and the process of working together to create it, is a way of like building connections and building understanding of each other's needs. I mean, I've found lots of times that if I interview people individually, it can be really useful and people can say some really interesting things and really important things. But that process of coming together and like working together on a shared task creates discussion, and very often people change their ideas within it. So the idea of the murals isn't that like each person gets a set amount of space. Some public art is like that everyone gets like a square. But the way we work isn't like that. Instead, it's about everybody discussing their experiences and what they would like other people to understand. And then everybody, like at least one element of everybody's ideas or drawings are included in the mural. So it doesn't make any difference whether one person said something or, lots of people said it. Like those ideas are all valid and we would include elements of them. And people then discuss together, the overall design and make sure that everybody is happy with the way their ideas are represented. But then it's also that the research itself creates something that people involved then feel some ownership over it. So it's not the same as, for example, if you write a book that goes in an academic library, then the people who've contributed their ideas are, they probably never even see it. Whereas this is a very visible and prominent output that people can own. And, very often people are very proud of it and will, come and show their friends and family. We always have an opening event as well where people come and they can invite whoever they would like to understand these messages. So that's the reasoning behind using murals as a research method.
Well, Rebecca, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming on the show. If people want to find more of Dr Rebecca Yeo, you are on x.com at disabmurals, and you can also read a lot more about these issues at disability-migration.org.uk. And the book is Disabling Migration Controls, which is available through open access at Routledge. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Andy, that's our show. We'll be back next week. See you then.
Speak to you then.
It's the sale of the century. The 3CR Garage Sale. Brought to you by the Sporting Record.
9 to 2, Saturday the 16th of November in the 3CR car park.
At the rear of 21 Smith Street, Fitzroy.
Records, CDs, books, household items, 3CR merch, new and pre-loved. You never know what you'll find.
And every cent goes to the station. The 3CR Garage Sale, 16th of November. It's the sale of the century.
Public transport's great.
What's not great is that unless you've got a radio with you, you can't listen to 3CR when you're on it.
Until now. The Community Radio Plus app lets you listen to us wherever you are.
Get on board and search Community Radio Plus wherever you get your apps.